Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 7, Emerging Adulthood. Let's get into it. Okay, so just some quick notes on emerging adulthood. It's defined as the period between the late teens and late 20s, ages typically between 18 and 29, consequently. Defined in the late 20th and early 21st century. During the late 19th century, novels about the struggles of adolescence first appeared in abundance, perhaps due to the greater array of choices adolescents had. The number of options has continued to grow, and now people often take longer before assuming adult roles. So the point of this slide is just to highlight that this is a kind of a new concept. Not super new, but comparatively, we all understood young childhood, older adults, etc. But this emerging adulthood, this period between adulthood and adolescence, that deals with a lot of life transitions, and one reason why it's suspected that this period, this developmental period, has maybe not been created, but has been more emphasized and become more consequential throughout history is due to industrialization. So that's what you see around, that late 19th century. Is this all of a sudden, there's more factories, people are leaving farm communities, moving to new cities, etc. So you have more choice. You're less destined to the plot of land, that you grew up on, or your small town city, for example. So we're going to walk through this, and it's kind of and because of that, a lot of this material is similar to adolescence. So I focused on things kind of outside the book for this chapter, because a lot of it's kind of, like I said, redundant with adolescence. So I included kind of the big features of the book, kind of the key points, and then I added some cross-cultural research and some other studies. All right, so let's talk about the features of emerging adulthood. It's an age of identity exploration, it's an age of instability, and it's an age of self-focus, according to some scholars. Identity exploration. Erickson proposed that it was during adolescence that humans wrestled with the question of identity, but trend during the 20th century of a prolonged adolescence in industrialized societies. So as I said in the first slide, you're seeing this period of rapid industrialization leading to prolonged adolescence, because alongside industrialization became a need to better educate workers, which meant more schooling, which meant kind of more of a delayed adulthood. So that's Erickson's historical period that he grew up in, kind of giving him a cohort fact of understanding when development occurs. So, but even Erickson eventually admitted that this emerging adulthood period is a trend that deals with prolonged adolescence and identity exploration. Age of instability. Emerging adults change jobs, relationships, and residencies more frequently than other age groups, which we all understand. You go to college, you start dating more, you change jobs, you're trying to find your career, so kind of age of instability. Age of self-focus, begin to see their parents as people, not just parents, something most adolescents fail to do. Few obligations to others, a time where they can do what they want with their life. So now you're out of high school, you're either in college, tech school, or you're starting a job. You're less likely to have children, or at least a lot of children. So just more freedom and less responsibilities is the idea here, which allows, at least in the United States, this idea that you can focus on yourself and develop on an individual level. And I should say that there are obviously variations within the U.S., but that's kind of the general idea. Age of feeling in between, gone through the changes of puberty, are typically no longer in high school, and many have moved out of their parents' house. May still be financially dependent on their parents to some degree, and typically have not finished their education, obtained a good job, in a committed relationship. So you have more freedom, you're taking on more adult-like roles. You may have a job, you may be in college or secondary schooling, but you don't have that degree yet, most likely, especially in your early 20s. You probably don't have your career lined up, especially in this historical era. And one example for financial dependency, even if you are independent, financial aid restrictions, for example, needing your parents to sign off on your financial aid, which is always a nice pain in the ass. So that feeling of in between, having those adult responsibilities, wanting to be free, but also still being connected to kind of your previous adolescent phase. Age of possibilities, more optimism as more 18 to 25-year-olds feel that they someday get to be where they want to be, the chance to transform their lives and move away from unhealthy environments. So now that you have more freedom, that means you can leave. You can get rid of a toxic family, toxic friends, high school, toxic high school relationships, etc. And it's a period of higher optimism because of that freedom that you have. You have more possibilities. So let's look at some variation across class, history, gender, race, etc. So usually there are 5 milestones associated with entering adulthood. And let's look at them. Completing school, leaving home, being financially independent, getting married, having at least one child. So as you can see here, a number of historical factors are embedded within these 5 milestones. So for example, leaving home. If you started college and say you wanted to move away at, whatever, some local housing, living on campus or, close to campus, it's harder to do during a pandemic due to a lot of reasons. Places of employment, jobs being closed down, people losing their jobs. So that financial squeeze, and you may need that extra social support from your family. So leaving home, again, historically affected. Becoming financially independent, same kind of thing. We'll talk about in later slides, but the wealth held by this generation of 18 to 30-year-olds being far less than previous generations. And getting married and having at least one child. We can look at the lower bullet point for that. And so in the United States in 1960, 77% of women and 65% of men had passed all 5 milestones by the age of 30. In 2000, fewer than half of women and less than 1/3 of men had done so by age 30. So again, you could see a quantification of those historical rates. And that's only in 2000. That was a long time ago. We had the Great Recession. A million things, a million things happened since 2000. So, and we know that there are historical trends of marriage declining among emerging adults in this historical period. And adults and emerging adults staying in school longer. So they're not completing school, at 18 or even 21 years old because people are staying for more degrees for a host of reasons. Now let's look at other cultural variations. Beginning internationally, emerging adults in Japan and South Korea, like Western Europeans, tend to enter marriage and parenthood around age 30, have social welfares that aid in transition. They pursue identity development during emerging adulthood, like their American and European counterparts, but within narrow boundaries set by their sense of obligation to others. Emerging adults in the US and Europe consistently rank financial independence among the most important markers of adulthood. Emerging adults with an Asian cultural background especially emphasize becoming capable of supporting parents financially as among the most important criteria. So in Japan and South Korea, for example, in Western European countries, their social welfare programs allow them to kind of ease into transitions. So even if they have children at a younger age, having paid time off, maybe having more a maternity leave, having more food programs for young children, etc., allows emerging adults to pursue other aspects of emerging adulthood, those factors. So if you have a child, for example, and you're able to take maternity leave or paternity leave or get social welfare assistance, you're able to then maybe attend college. You have extra time. You have extra resources provided to you by your country. So that changes, the trajectory of emerging adulthood within those countries. And but in contrast, these Asian countries, and specifically we looked at Japan and South Korea here, is they emphasize the importance of supporting their parents financially, while the U.S. and Western European countries have more are focused on that financial independence. So they are both emphasizing the need for finances, but kind of the reasoning behind that is different, with the Asian countries being more of that collectivist. I'm trying to take care of my family, and more of the Western European, United States countries focusing more on their own personal financial independence. But of course, there are variations across countries, and also countries are shifting in their degrees of collectivism and individualism. So this is not written in stone, and there are obviously differences between individuals in both countries. And this is kind of just a little tease for the next chapter. Very exciting, I know. So established adults, individuals between 30 and 45, individuals residing in industrialized countries are obtaining advanced education well into their 20s. Following their education, those entering careers typically engage in frequent job changes in their 20s before settling into a stable job. Established adults take on greater career responsibilities, gain expertise, and begin moving up their organization. They delay having marriages and having children until their 30s. So basically the point here is just kind of to highlight the differences of emerging adulthood and more of this established adults. Then kind of the key points here is that you're more stable. You have more knowledge, you have more responsibilities, because by 30, 45, that's when now we're seeing trends of more people delaying having children, being married until that age period. Consequently, you're having more responsibilities, as I stated, as an established adult. Now compare that to 18 to 29-year-olds, those emerging adults. And the majority of 18 to 29-year-olds are unmarried. Reasons for cohabitation include convenience, in a romantic relationship and want an affordable living arrangement, a trial marriage, and an alternative to marry, no intention to marry. And on the right side, you can see the rates of marriage in the U.S., and you can see that the rate of Americans who have never been married has consistently gone up through the decades. There are reasons for not being married, as I kind of outlined here, and specifically reasons for cohabitation. And that's, one's convenient. You're splitting bills. Trial marriage, so you're living together before marriage, and you're like, oh, I'm not really ready to be married yet, but this is kind of a period where we can kind of test the dynamics of that. Or an alternative to marry. So some in this age group, and you're seeing high numbers of that, a kind of a generational effect of individuals with no intention to marry, but have the intention to be with a specific partner in a long-term relationship. We also have class and other gender variations. Lack of employment and lower wages have especially contributed to males residing with their parents. Men who are employed are less likely to live at home. Wages for young men, adjusting for inflation, have been falling since 1970 and correlate with the rise of young men living with their parents. The 2007 Great Recession contributed to the increase in early adults living at home. It's linked to structural changes in the political economy. So since the 1970s, as I stated, pay rates have declined for all workers, but particularly men, because women were excluded from the workforce in large numbers prior to the 1970s. So you're going to see by default men losing more wages because the women were literally excluded, so they had no wages, But still, on average, the total income across genders has declined. And kind of just some basic points here, and that's that if you are unemployed for a male, you're more likely to live at home. And historical effects. So 2007 Great Recession saw an increase of young men returning home, and and obviously for COVID, we see men and women of emerging adulthood both returning home in higher numbers due to obvious reasons that you guys are all experiencing right now, just lack of employment opportunities, needing social support, and just the stress of dealing with all this. And it's linked to structural changes in the political economy. So from the 70s on, we saw kind of a decrease, well, kind of a restructuring of the economy that has contributed to some of the changes that we're seeing today. That is of falling income and stagnation across gender, but especially men, because again, women were excluded from the workforce. And I should add that obviously also disproportionately impacts racial minorities, and we'll get to that in a little later on in this chapter. Sex and gender roles, gender role norms, and gender stereotypes. We've used this slide before, but kind of just bringing it back because we're reviewing developmental chronologically. Gender roles, patterns of behaviors that females and males should adopt in a particular society. Gender role norms, society's expectations or standards concerning what males and females should be like. Gender stereotypes, overgeneralized and largely inaccurate beliefs about the characteristics of all males and females, generated by society's gender norms. Studies have found that men and women describe themselves more similar in the 90s than they did in the 70s. And that can be related to a whole host of issues, in particular women, again, being excluded from higher education historically, being excluded from some jobs. And because of that, people explaining that exclusion through kind of these gender stereotypes, for example, women not being good at math, physics, whatever. But as those gaps in educational outcomes and employment have declined and decreased, I should say, you will consequently have people describe themselves as less differently, because you can't say, oh, women are not good at math or whatever, because you literally you're working alongside women. And why are you working alongside women more? And in this case, the studies in the 1990s and 1970s, it's because women are less systematically excluded from these employment opportunities. So that's just kind of one way how those kind of larger, again, going back to those Bronfenbrennan systems, those macro systems, those chrono systems impacting our conceptualization of gender roles and gender stereotypes. So this psychologist here argues that changes in gender roles are related to traits in adulthood, and they're shaped by the parental imperative. Requirement that mothers and fathers adopt different roles to raise children successfully. Men must emphasize their quote-unquote masculine qualities to feed and protect their families. Women must express their feminine qualities to nurture the young, meet the emotional needs of the families. Now I'm going to look at some cross-cultural studies about gender roles and gender-related traits in a second here, but you can see here that the historical period you live in and the country you live in would be different or affect these gender roles and gender-related traits. So going back to that example of Korea, of Japan, of Western European countries that have those social welfare programs that allow paternity leave, maternal leave. Well, because of that, your parenting roles, your parenting responsibilities are going to be different, because one parent does not have to carry the workload in the house, and another parent does not have to focus their workload on working at a job outside the home. So through those macro system changes, so chrono system changes, you see shifts again in gender roles and gender related traits. But now let's look at some international studies here dealing with gender roles and gender related traits. Cultural variation in gender roles can arise from different environments within which people live. In those cultures where the environment is harsh and requires courage and physical prowess to secure a living, that is, for example, places where large game is hunted or risky deep-sea fishing is performed. Cultures of masculinity that value the strength and toughness of males are more likely to emerge. South Pacific island of Truk, I should say, men traditionally had to go on dangerous deep-sea fishing expeditions to obtain food for their families. Trukis greatly value masculinity, demonstrated by young men engaging in frequent, violent, drunken nights. So that's just kind of a cultural practice where young males kind of wrestle with each other, etc., or more violent kind of fighting. But the point here is that the environment contributes greatly to the impact of gender roles and gender-related traits. In conditions where, harsh conditions where you have to hunt an animal, have to do some kind of deep sea diving where you need strength, endurance, those physical, quote unquote masculine traits, you see cultures value masculinity more and kind of have more often rigid gender stereotypes. In cultures where the environment is more benign and food is plentiful, androgynous gender roles are more likely to emerge. Men in Tahiti do not hunt. The shallow lagoons provide ample fishing without the need to venture into treacherous waters. In the rich volcanic soil, it allows for the easy harvesting of taro, cassava, coconuts, and fruit. There's virtually no warfare feuding in Tahiti, and there's little evidence that masculinity is a matter of much concern for Tahiti. In general, a survey of the norms for masculinity across diverse ecological context led one anthropologist to conclude that, quote, the harsher the environment and the scarcer the resources, the more manhood is stressed as the inspiration and the goal. So this kind of goes back to the original bullet point of these cross-cultural studies, is that your environment dictates how a culture, I should say, or in a country defines their gender roles and their gender-related traits. In Tahiti, because they're able to gather food through less dangerous ways, masculinity is not a big concern for people living in Tahiti, and they don't concern themselves with masculinity, as I just saying, and thus consequently are not focused on those gender-specific traits. What can I do as a man, as a woman, to demonstrate my femininity, my masculinity? That's lessened. The likelihood of masculinity being important is lessened by the plentiful, the benign nature of the environment you're interacting with. So again, your environment literally impacting the cultures, your countries, your societies' understanding of gender roles and gender-related traits. These are not biological universal traits. They vary by culture and by environment, consequently. Moving on to sexual orientation. Kinsey was among the first to conceptualize sexuality as a continuum rather than a strict dichotomy of gay or straight, create a 7-point rating scale that ranged from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual. Research supports the idea of a continuum. Homosexual behavior has been documented in over 450 species. Approximately 3% of males, 1.5% of females identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual. In 1973, the APA stated that same-sex attraction is a normal variation of human sexuality and does not support use of therapy to change orientations. Prenatal environments could be linked to gender nonconformity and sexual orientation, but it's likely a complex interaction of genetic, biological, social, and cultural factors. So the idea here is individuals not being 100% gay, 100% heterosexual, but some kind of continuum. And Kinsey specifically had a 7-point rating scale, but there are other researchers who have different scales. But the idea is continuum versus dichotomy. Continuing on the stages of transgender identity, which we've talked about in previous chapters. And our 5 stages are listed here, and there's no single path depending on the social and economic resources and characteristics of an individual person. Let's wrap up those pathways We're going to look at the final three here: exploration, intimacy, and identity integration. Exploration is learning as much as possible, testing boundaries of what this identity means. Research can consider how best to live, your name, your clothing, your surgery, your hormones. So just kind of the entirety of emerging adulthood, kind of finding that identity and learning about yourself and society at large. Intimacy. Transgender men seem to have an easier time than transgender women. Positive intimate relationships are influenced by one's sexual orientation. Like non-transgender youth, heterosexuals have a smoother path than homosexual oriented trans youth. So the idea here is just like non-transgender youth, society is more, or in our culture, in this historical period, I should say, are more welcoming. It's more easier to navigate your life as a heterosexual than a homosexual trans youth. Identity integration, union of one's public and private life. Research indicates that their gender perceptions of self are much like those of transgender children of their expressed roles. So the idea here is that even as youth, younger children, transgender youth have similar, transgender girls have similar gender perceptions as cisgender girls. Let's look at the minority stress model. It argues that an unaccepting social environment results in both external and internal stress, which contributes to poor mental health. Studies indicate that participants who identified as transgender and gender nonconforming have significantly higher levels of anxiety and depression than those identifying as cisgender. External stressors include discrimination, harassment, and prejudice. Internal stresses include negative thoughts, feelings, and emotions resulting from one's identity. So you can apply this minority stress model to any minority with any particular population. We talked about weathering effects, those allostatic load in previous chapters. We talked about ACEs, adverse child events. And similarly here, we kind of see a minority stress model with the collection of stressors within a given environment. And those stressors include external and internal, impacting an individual's development and harming their health. And again, you can see this and name your minority group, disabled individuals, racial minorities, and in this case here, we're focusing on sexual minorities. Just some examples. Sexual minorities regularly experience stigma, harassment, discrimination, and violence based on their sexual orientation. Research has shown that gay, lesbian, bisexual teenagers are at higher risk of depression and suicide due to exclusion from social groups, rejection from peers and family. And I should add that new research demonstrates a similar finding for transgender teenagers. Discrimination can occur in the workplace, in housing, at schools, and in numerous public settings. Like all research, the majority of empirical and clinical research on LGBT populations are done with largely white, middle-class, well-educated samples. Racism, classism, and other forms of oppression. So let's walk through this. Discrimination occurring in multiple places. So again, this goes back to society, these macro structures, those macro systems, those mesosystems, chronosystems, as Bradford Brenner would talk about, factors within those systems impacting particular minorities in different ways, with those who are disenfranchised kind of being more harmed by particular factors, or at least particular negative factors within the environment, or some factors affecting some groups differently, some positively and some negatively. But the point here is that some groups will within certain historical periods, within certain countries, experience more stressors than others, which will have harmful effects for their health, obviously. But there's a limitation to research, and we see this in all research, which we talked about, and that is the majority of research is done on college populations. Now, LGBT populations in college obviously are not unstressed, neither are any minority populations, but they are going to have more resources and be subject to kind of less, on average, I should say, less stressors than black, poor trans people would. So just because we understand in our culture, in our country, that racism, classism, and other forms of oppression kind of filter out those groups of people in higher education. So what we're really doing, we're testing the impact of stress, of discrimination on kind of populations that are most likely to have more resources, have the most protective factors. So if anything, these minority stress models, these weathering effects, are actually more harmful to the general population than studies have shown, because again, we typically study populations that have more resources than the general population. So I just want to grab one quick study on this. Disparities in adverse child experiences among sexual minority and heterosexual adults results from multi-state probability-based samples. So we'll just look at this here. Compared with heterosexual respondents, gay, lesbian, and bisexual individuals experience increased odds of 6 of 8 or 7 of 8 adverse child experiences. Our conclusion, sexual minority individuals had increased exposure to multiple developmental risk factors. So this is just an A study demonstrating that individuals with sexual minority individuals within these groups were more likely to have higher ACEs than compared to heterosexual peers. So kind of being more at risk, experiencing more trauma as a population, which, as we just saw, has health slash negative developmental effects. Attaining sexual maturity. Incorporate into their identities concepts of themselves as sexual males or females, or non-binary, I should say. Figure out how to express their sexuality in relationships. Become aware of their sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is stable across the lifespan for those who identify as 100% heterosexual and 100% homosexual. Teens who disclose their same-sex orientation to someone report higher levels of self-esteem and overall well-being than teens who have not done so. Those who come out may feel more comfortable with their identity and have the personal resources to manage the stresses that accompany coming out. So kind of this is just a period, as we've talked about this entire chapter, of identity formation here, sexual identity formation. Going back to the Kinsey's continuum of sexuality, we see that those individuals who define themselves as 100% homosexual or 100% heterosexual maintain that identity across their lifespan. And teens who disclose or quote, coming out, report higher levels of self-esteem and overall well-being. But that goes back to kind of those correlation questions, that directionality question. Is it that those teens who come out already have higher self-esteem and overall well-being, and which allows them to come out? Or is it that teens have average or lower self-esteem and overall well-being, but then they come out and then they now have elevated self-esteem and overall well-being? See what I mean here? This is a correlation study, so it's difficult to tell the directionality. But in general, those who are more comfortable with their identity have the personal resources to manage stresses that accompany coming out. So again, those protective factors allowing an individual to be comfortable with themselves, have better well-being, higher self-esteem. So because it literally protective factors, it buffers the impacts of those of the traumas that in this case a sexual minority is more likely to encounter throughout their development. Continuing on, sexual responsiveness tends to peak in the late teens and early 20s. Responsiveness begins a slow decline in the late 20s and into the early 30s. That's among men, I should say. Women often find that they become more sexually responsive throughout their 20s and 30s and may peak in their late 30s or early 40s. It's likely due to greater self-confidence and reduced inhibitions about sexuality, which goes back to the gender roles and gender stereotypes, dictating behavior in this case, or at least influencing the likelihood of behavior, I should say. In this case, affecting sexual maturity and sexual responsiveness in women. Kind of pushing back at those dates, or at least contributing to that delay as compared to men, because of the negative connotation associated with those gender stereotypes of sexuality. the brain and sex, the hypothalamus is argued to be the most important part of the brain for sexual functioning. Animal studies have found that destruction of certain areas of the hypothalamus causes complete elimination of sexual behavior. It controls the pituitary gland, which secrete hormones that control the glands of the body. And we talked about this with the HPA axis, but obviously the HPA axis is not just implicated in stress, but other hormones as well. And looking at one specifically, oxytocin, which we spoke about, I believe, last chapter. And it's typically referred to kind of as this love drug, but I personally know someone who does a lot of work with oxytocin, she and other research supports the fact that it's really a booster to social cues, good and bad. So I'm kind of just being a little elitist here, being in the know. So I think you should conceptualize oxytocin as just boosting sensitivity to all social cues, good and bad, but it's implicated in sex, and it's released during sexual intercourse when an orgasm is achieved, and released in females when they give birth or are breastfeeding. And returning to this classic chart that I've shown, I don't even know how many times at this point in the semester, but the HPA system. HPA system is implicated in releasing hormones, and the endocrine glands secrete chemicals called hormones directly into the bloodstream, as I just stated. Ovaries and testes secrete testosterone and estrogen, progesterone, which stimulate the production of growth hormones. So in the case of sexual maturation, that's kind of the process that we see on a biological level. Let's move on to cognitive development. And looking at post-formal thought, it's more complex than formal operational stage. This is going back to Piaget's stages. Adolescents tend to believe there's a logical correct answer to every question. If you apply logic, you find an absolute truth. They think in dichotomies. Ideas are good or true or false, good or bad, and there is no middle ground. The pendulum task has a design answer. What about problems that have no well-defined set of solutions? Closed set of ideas versus an open set of ideas, which are most adult issues. So what are we getting at here? A few points here. That is that adolescents, they're, as we saw in our last chapter, they're focused on themselves, they're focused on logically thinking things through. They can apply some degree of scientific methodology to the world around them, and they're trying to find, the absolute truth, the one solution to every problem. They think in dichotomies, good, bad, true, or false. And they believe you've applied a certain set of premises, certain amounts of logic, you're going to come to the ultimate truth, and bam, that is that. And for example, that pendulum test that we talked about, I think, last chapter, where there's sets of weights and sets of strings on a kind of a platform, a pendulum, and you just arrange the weights and the strings in a certain way, and that makes the pendulum swing one way or the other or be perfectly balanced. Well, in that test, that has a specific kind of correct set of answers. But in the real world, that is adulthood, we operate in a world where there is no clear-cut one simple solution to our problems in the world. There are open sets of ideas versus closed sets of ideas. So closed sets of ideas would be an example of getting that pendulum problem. There's a problem, there's a solution, you figure it out. Well, open sets of ideas are kind of more like relationships and just navigating complex social scenarios, which we're about to get into. Relativistic thinking. Knowledge depends on its context and the subjective perspective of the knower. Stop getting drunk or we break up. Absolute level students use fewer thinking styles, less creative and cognitive complexity. Dialectical thinking, detecting paradoxes and inconsistencies among ideas and trying to reconcile them. So let's combine our two slides here. We had the adolescents relying more on that formal operation stage, that logic, that one solution, versus as an emerging adult, engaging more in this relativistic thinking, understanding that knowledge and perspectives matter when coming up with solutions, and that there may not be one particular solution. So stop getting drunk or we break up. So you lay down an ultimatum, and then your husband or wife comes home drunk again or drinks too much at home, etc. And then you end up staying with that individual. Well, logically, for an adolescent, they would say they would make no sense. But maybe as an adult, you understand that that person's depressed, that person had a rough day, that person maybe is having fun, is playing with their friends, and everybody's drinking. We're all having a good time. It's not that absolute. Those ultimatums are not as absolute to emerging adults and adults in general than adolescents. Absolute level students use fewer thinking styles, less creative, and cognitive complexity. So the idea here is that absolute level students, those relying on those formal thought operations, those absolute truths, they use fewer thinking styles. Why is that? Because they don't have to. They don't have to be creative or engage in cognitive complexity, because there's the truth, and that's the truth, and I don't have to entertain anything else. And dialectical thinking develops during the post-formal thought period, and that's detecting paradoxes and inconsistencies among ideas and trying to reconcile them. So understanding that people have different perspectives, that circumstances matter, that the context matters, understanding that, and then trying to reconcile those inconsistencies to come to a workable solution. Let's move on to education. Just kind of some statistics here, and you can kind of see how the rates of education's attainment for emerging adults in our historical era have increased, and you can see men and women about equally holding bachelor's degrees or higher, with women actually having slightly more. And compared to other historical periods, which are not listed here, these numbers are way lower, 100 years ago, for example, which have effects on our population. And one of those effects, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is student debt, which is over $1 trillion right now, with people on average holding, I think the median is around 40,000 right now. Average being a little lower, but the median, because you see people in private institutions or had to take out more loans, maybe entered college, university, or trade school poorer than another group of individuals, a wealthier, higher class set of individuals, taking on more debt. So debt across the board is higher, and you can see wealth by generation, which is kind of that middle graph here. Look at the difference between the generations of wealth. With a silent generation going down, that's because they're dying every year. The baby boomers having way more wealth, and then Gen Z, and then millennials, and then consequently, or I should say Gen X, then millennials, and then Gen Z, who really has not had the opportunity to accumulate as much wealth, but projections are not looking good, as both millennials and Gen Z are at the very bottom. So that's one consequence of educational attainment, is student debt. But this also, like all things, has a negative impact, or a disproportionate negative impact on minority groups. So, for example, more than 84% of college-educated black households in their 30s have student debt, up from 35% 3 decades ago, when many baby boomers were at the same age. It was a median of 44,000, up from less than 6,000. 53% of white college education households in their 30s have debt, up from 27% 3 decades earlier. The median amount rose to 35,000 from 8,000. Black graduate household incomes have grown more slowly than those of college graduates in general. Median income for black college-educated households in their 30s increased 7% from the early 90s to late 2010s. Income for their white counterparts rose 13%. So kind of going back to our main points here is that in general, student loan debt not looking great for any demographic. But for those who are already at a institutional disadvantage for many historical and contemporary reasons, those traumas, in this case student debt, impacts them more, with their median debt being about, 9,000 more, and their income rising really about half, 7% versus 13%. Again, neither good, but with black Americans being much less than white Americans. And actually, the the top here, this little screen grab I grabbed from a recent article. College was supposed to close the wealth gap for Black Americans. The opposite happened. So what we're basically seeing here is the wealth gap between Black Americans and Americans at large and white Americans have not increased, but has in some either stagnated or some researchers argue increased due to many reasons, but one reason in particular is student loan debt. And you can see the numbers here with student loan debt being higher for Black Americans than white Americans, even though everybody is going through a lot of student loan debt issues. Psychosocial development, theories of personality, trait theory. They use factor analysis to reduce diversity of personality descriptors to underlying traits. It analyzes the correlation among response on personality interviews based on a lexical approach, assumption that the most crucial factors of personality are embedded in our language. Factor analysis of trait terms in dictionaries or works of literature. The Big Five: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. I'm sure most of you have not been exposed to this statistical analysis called factor analysis, because I had not at your age, and if you have, props to you. But the idea here is that researchers can look at just thousands of textbooks, of dictionaries, and kind of, in layman terms here, look at the correlations between certain words. And then, so you're looking at thousands of words, and you're looking at how correlated all the words are, and then you see which of the words are most correlated. So you got 1,000 words, and you're looking at all the correlations, and you're noticing clusters of those words really correlated. Well, what these researchers found was that there's 5 clusters of words that are really correlated. And they name those: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So that's kind of a statistical method by which you find these larger themes within personalities. Okay? And the most familiar one is those ENTJs and INTFs, whatever, etc. So that's where that came from. And that is a trait theory of personality. With the idea being you fall somewhere on those traits. So you have X amount of extroversion, X amount of agreeableness, neuroticism, etc. And then based on what percentage of those big five traits you are assigned 5 little letters. You're introverted instead of extroverted, etc. And that tells you your personality, which is thought to carry with you, which is supposed to impact your behavior in every circumstance. That's your trait. That's who you are across all circumstances. Okay? And you probably have taken some quizzes like this online. And you can easily find this by Googling Big Five theory test, and just answer some questions, and then they'll give you a kind of review of your personality traits. Now let's look at some cross-cultural studies of the Big Five. In general, such investigations reveal that although the Big Five does appear to be fairly cross-culturally robust, it is not an exhaustive list of personality traits in all cultures or how often the traits are used. So again, going back to that factor analysis, that trait approach to personality, the Big Five, the idea here is you look at these dictionaries, these works of literature, you find correlations, and you find clusters of correlations of thousands of words, of dozens of words, and then you label those clusters, right? And then the idea here is that those Big Five, are universal across all cultures. Well, research has found that, as I stated, that there is evidence of Big Five cross-culturally, but not all cultures use and emphasize all 5 of those traits, and some cultures have more traits than 5, and some have less. So let's look at some specific studies. Indigenous Chinese study found 4 of the same factors as the Big Five. Openness to experience did not correlate with any of the Chinese factors, however, and a new factor, interpersonal relatedness, which was uncorrelated with any of the Big Five. A list of Filipino personality traits was developed, revealed 5 traits that were highly similar to the Big Five, but also had 2 additional factors, temperamentalness and negative valence, which did not correlate with any of the core 5. Study of Arabic speakers in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the Palestinian West Bank found evidence for the Big Five, plus honesty and unconventionality. And then finally, the Simane, who are a foraging horticultural group in Bolivia, found very little evidence in support of the Big Five. Their personality characteristics were better explained by just two factors, neither of which were approximated any of the Big Five. Other studies with non-industrialized populations have had comparable results. So what are our big picture takeaways here? Well, what they're doing is each one of these studies did their own factor analysis. They looked at either the books, the literature of those cultures, or the spoken words, maybe the poetry, however, in ways that those cultures communicated ideas. They looked at the words in them. They looked at the lexicon of those literatures, those oral histories, those whatever the methodology by which people pass on cultural ideas within that culture. They then did the same thing. They looked at correlations. They clustered, and then they found what kind of groups of correlations clustered, that is, gathered together, and then they created their own set of Big Five, or as we've seen, Big Sevens, Big Twos, etc. And then they compare the U.S. Big Five, and for example, in our second bullet point, the indigenous Chinese Big Five, and they see, okay, we found 5 factors in our Big Five. The indigenous Chinese found 7 factors. Let's see if they correlate. And what they found is that 2 factors did not correlate, aka there are 2 personality traits in this indigenous Chinese studies that were not found in the United States. And similar with Filipino, they had 2 different additional factors. So they had a Big 7 instead of a Big 5. And same thing in some studies of Arabic cultures. They had a Big 7. But then look at the Bolivian tribe. They just had a Big 2, neither one of which were related to our Big 5. So you can see here cross-culturally that although the Big 5, that there's evidence of some of the Big 5 factors across cultures. Some cultures have only 2 of them, some of the cultures have 5 of them, but 2 other ones, and some cultures have none of them. So culture, again, we see impacting the personality, the traits of an individual. Let's look at cross-cultural findings in the United States. And you can see a little graph here that I found from another resource. North Central Great Plains, especially around Minnesota and Wisconsin, is a friendly and conventional region where residents are the highest in the country for the traits of extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. Cluster 1. The western states from Oregon to Arizona are a lax and creative region where there is low neuroticism and higher openness to experience. Northeast, especially New York and Massachusetts, are a temperamental and uninhibited region where people score the highest on neuroticism and the lowest on conscientiousness. Extroverted people are more likely to appreciate wide open vistas such as oceans, where introverts prefer mountains. So even in the United States, you can see clusters, and we all understand this. You go into specific regions of the United States and understand that there's different cultures related to particular particular parts of the United States. And this is just an example of the Big 5 demonstrating those cross-cultural differences within the United States. But again, for all studies of cross-cultural studies, there's wide variability within individuals, and these are just group averages. Now, kind of inherent in that trait theory of personality, and many personality researchers argue that not only are those traits consistent across all contexts, which we've just reviewed, across cultures, but they say that even within a particular culture, those traits that you bring to the table, that X percentage of extroversion, neuroticism, are the same across all social contexts. And they stay the same across your lifespan. So does research support this? Well, one study conducted in 62 countries investigated how people's personalities changed as they entered adulthood. The researchers found a universal pattern of personality maturation as people age. Reaching adulthood, people become more conscientious and agreeable, less neurotic, and slightly more extroverted and open to new experiences. But the specific timing of this maturing process varies by culture. In societies where people took on adult roles sooner, in terms of starting a family and entering the workforce, their personalities matured more quickly. In cultures where people delayed having a family and entered the workforce at an older age, personalities matured more slowly. So it's just that the pace of adolescent development is tied to taking on more adult roles. A key reason then why adolescent angst is less common in pre-industrial societies is that people there assume adult responsibility sooner. So what do we find? We find that in general, there are universal patterns of personality maturation. People become less neurotic, more extroverted, more open to new experiences, but the timing of that process varies by culture. With societies who mature quickly or require their members to mature quickly, such as pre-industrialized society, reaching those milestones of personality maturation quicker. And consequently, they experience less angst because think about it. You have less choices. Say you're born in a rural farm in the Amazon rainforest or something. There's not a lot of, or I should say, there are less relative choices for an individual within that cultural context. So therefore, you have less anxiety about what it is I'm going to do because you have a much better idea of what it is you're going to do. So you have less angst in pre-industrial societies is what cross-cultural research typically demonstrates. For adult attachment styles, and the kind of the figure on the right goes into more detail about that, but I'm not going to read that specifically. But the more famous attachment styles are those of childhood, which are thought to relate to a whole host of adult outcomes, which we've already talked about. But for adults, their styles of attachment are related to the quality of their romantic relationships, their well-being, and physical and mental health in later life. The quality of the parent-child relationship that an adult experiences earlier in life predicts adult attachment style and romantic relationship quality. So going back to that childhood attachment to their parents, predicts the type of attachment, adult attachment style, I should say, that adults have. And consequently, the quality of their romantic relationships and their relationships in general as an adult. Sibling relationships, they're typically the longest lasting relationship. Relationships often become warmer and more equal in adulthood, often grow closer in old age. Siblings who enjoyed a close relationship during childhood are likely to be drawn closer after significant life events such as parental death. Siblings who had poor relationships growing up may clash in response to the same event, fight over inheritance, for example. So our big takeaways here is that because you're the same age as your sibling, those are the relationships that are going to be the long-lasting, kind of by default. In general, your relationship with your siblings become more warm and equal. But if you had a positive relationship with your sibling as a child, you're obviously more likely to have a positive relationship as an adult. But that's only more likely, and obviously there are exceptions. For those who have poor relationships as an adult, the death of a family can bring additional stress and additional arguing contentiousness among siblings, while those who are close, the death of a family member, of a parent, can bring the siblings closer together. An interesting historical moment is this middle-generational squeeze. It's a situation of middle-aged adults pressured by demands from both the younger and middle and older generations simultaneously. Now, I didn't really know where to put this. I'll probably include this in the next chapter as well, but I think it was relevant here. 33% of women aged 55 to 69 report caring for both older and younger generation. Daughters provide more emotional support. Sons are about as involved in providing help with practical tasks and financial assistance. There's caregiver burden, psychological distress with the demands of providing care for someone with physical and cognitive impairments, do not want to help or help out of duty, lack personal resources, lack social and cultural support for caregiving. Cultural norms affect stress associated with caring for older adults. So what we're looking at here is this generational effect. So we have older adults living longer, right? Which means that their children are more likely to have to take care of their parents because they've lived, the life expectancy has grown, whatever it is, 20 years over the last 100 years. While at the same time, that middle squeeze, that middle generation will also have their own children. So they're going to have dual responsibilities, creating this middle generation squeeze where they have to take care of their own children and at the same time take care of their older adult parents. And that can cause a lot of stress, especially if you lack personal resources, lack social resources, or a culture of caring. That's the community coming together to take care of those older adults, and that's kind of something that's going to have to be dealt with for this generation. And how it is we deal with that on a countrywide level remains to be seen. Let's talk about love. Sternberg's triangle theory of love. Sternberg identified different types of love based on the strength of three components: passion, intimacy, commitment, with passion being romantic feelings, sexual attraction and excitement; intimacy, feelings of warmth, closeness, caring, trust; and commitment involves first deciding that one loves the other person and then committing to a long-term relationship. So you have these three components of love. And you can vary on, obviously, the degree to which, or the levels of the love within a particular component. So you can have high passion, low commitment, or etc. And here is just kind of a quick example of the different combinations that Sternberg describes in his theory of love, based on his components of love. Now, I hinted at this earlier in the lecture, U.S. historical trends in marriage. In 1960, only about 1 in 10 of adults aged 25 and older had never been married. In 2012, that had risen to 1 in 5. And I should add that trend continues to this day, with less adults aged 25 and older having never been married. With more adults aged 25 and older never being married. While just over half, 53%, of unmarried adults say they would eventually like to get married, 32% are not sure, and 13% do not want to get married. So the idea here is not even that some adults, emerging adults, are delaying their marriage, but other adults do not want to get married at all. Pew Research survey of Americans respondents were asked to indicate which of the following statements came closer to their own views. So they had two views, and they have to decide which of those views they believe is closer to their own views. Or two statements, they have to decide which is closer to their own views. The first one: society is better off if people make marriage and having children a priority. Point number 2: society is just as well off if people have priorities other than marriage and children. Young adults aged 18 to 29, when this survey was administered, were more likely to endorse the second view than adults aged 30 to 49, 67% and 53% respectively. So both cohorts, basically everyone over 50, agreeing with the second statement more than the first statement. So generational effects. But the younger you are, the more likely you are to agree with the first statement over the second statement. While 50 and older adults were more likely to endorse the first statement. So that's kind of like the cutoff, when you see a flip of the majority of that age group endorsing the second statement over the first statement. So these are broad cultural shifts that are relatively new in the United States. And that is a shift from prioritizing marriage and children to more career-oriented lifespans. Now, the implications for that are unknown at this point. We see a lot of different trends going on in the United States for a whole host of economic, political, and social reasonings, and it kind of remains to be seen what the impact of these preferences will be. But one big problem for older adults is if people are living longer and people have less children, they're going to have less social support, which can increase not just later life care, but kind of loneliness. What happens in a country that was already individualized? and start to see a reduction of their family, of their children, of social connections, just broadly speaking, in life, and that can have repercussions across the country. Obviously, you can replace those or fulfill those social needs through other mechanisms. But what will those mechanisms be with the decline of children, of marriage, of various other social institutions, a decrease of political participation, of political groups, of community groups? So how can that be addressed moving forward? And that we don't know how that will turn out. But we do see trends in the United States of more individualization, and larger trends of individualization within the United States. And I believe that, and I think research has demonstrated, that those specific components of it contribute to that increase of individualization and loneliness and atomization in this country. Now let's look at some cross-cultural studies and historical trends in marriage. Historically, the majority of marriages around the world have been arranged by families rather than by the couples themselves. Percentage of arranged marriages have recently been dropping in many cultures, including China, Japan, India, Turkey, and among Orthodox Jews. In India, more than 90% of marriages are facilitated by parents and other elder family members. Attitudes among younger Indians are changing, however, and popular culture celebrates the idea of love marriages. Worldwide, there are different kinds of arranged and love marriages. A survey of mate selection practices in 186 small-scale societies found that individual choice, is the results of which are on the right-hand side. And you can see the differences between men and women across these small-scale societies. And even though we have this idea of just arranged marriage, there are different components and different versions of arranged marriages across different cultures. And finally, individual choice without the need to seek approval, which perhaps is the most common practice among Westerners today, was evident in only 31% of small-scale societies in men and only 8% for women. So the idea here is that this is kind of a new phenomenon of marriage for love across human culture. And another study demonstrates this point. They asked college students in several countries the following question: if a man or a woman had all other qualities you desired, would you marry this person if you were not in love with him or her? About 50% of participants from India and Pakistan said they would marry this person. Another 25% said they were undecided. The vast majority, more than 80% of Americans, Britons, Australians, and Latin Americans said they would not. And only a small percentage, less than 5% of people from those countries said they would. In 1967, interestingly, you can ask that same question, and they found that about 65% of males, but only 24% of women said they would not marry someone they did not love. Marrying someone because you have fallen in love with the person is a relatively new idea, and one that's somewhat uncommon in the context of all the marriages that have occurred throughout human history. So even in the United States, you see large shifts in how much love prior to marriage is required for marriage across genders, across countries, and across historical periods. So again, kind of the point being that this is kind of a relatively new historical phenomenon that's evolving across all cultures in this era. Let's talk about the child-rearing family. New parenthood is a stressful transition. Marital satisfaction typically slightly declines in the first year after a baby is born and continues to decline after. Spillover effects from work stress on family life or vice versa. Claims energy from marital relationship can disproportionately harm mother's sense of mastery/self-esteem. Fathers often become more involved in childcare when a second child is born. Most mothers work outside the home. Half or more of both moms and dad are in dual career families, say they find it difficult to balance work and family. Parents emphasize the positives about parenthood, feel that's contributed greatly to their personal development. All right, so although we see that there is a stressful transition, you're obviously new mothers understand this, new parents, fathers as well understand this, that Meeting the needs of a new baby can be stressful, and they typically report that it is stressful. And it can have, depending on the makeup of the household, the gendered responsibilities, the gender stereotypes within a household, or gender roles within a household, it can have disproportionate effects on a mother's sense of mastery and self-esteem. However, today the majority of households have parents who work. And this has been a trend since about the 1970s, really, of as income has stagnated for American households, the need to bring in that second household income has increased. So you have like this trend of income stagnation or decline across decades, which means that the goods of and things cost more money, so you need to bring more income. So therefore, now mothers, women who have been historically excluded from institutions have now been one reason why they have been able to work their way through institutions, and the level of discrimination against them decrease is just due to the raw need that incomes have stagnated across the country for decades now. Now, even though that stress is present and parents report that stress, parents also report that they feel positive about parenthood, and it contributed a great deal to their personal development, their maturity. And I should also add that there are cultural effects, there are country effects, there are those macroeconomic effects. If you're in a circumstance where you have maternity leave, you have paternity leave, those stresses, that difficulty balancing work and family are obviously going to be decreased in those contexts. Looking at childless married couples, childlessness does not diminish the well-being of adults. Sometimes boosts it. Marital satisfaction higher than couples with children during the child-rearing years. So those first few years or so, a couple of years, where it can be very stressful for new parents. But having a children does not guarantee happiness, but not having a child does not mean unhappiness. So going back to the previous slide, that although that can be a stressful circumstance, what have we talked about in this class a couple chapters ago? There can be good stress. Stress can allow for growth if certain other factors are present. If there's family support, social support, cultural support, etc., that you have the capabilities, even the personal resources that allow you to buffer the stresses, the negative, the toxic aspects of stress within this transition, and while also allowing you to grow. So convert that possible toxic stress, such as a teenage pregnancy, for example, to a poor home, taking that same stressor, that childbirth, and making it into a good stress due to your resources and your that occur on a community level, and a household level, and at a personal level. Gay and lesbian families. Gay and lesbian relationships evolve through the same stages of development as heterosexual couples. Relationships are more egalitarian. That is, parents share responsibilities equally and tend to work out a division of labor based on who is talented at or does not mind doing certain tasks. Lesbian mothers are similar to heterosexual mothers. Children have similar developmental outcomes. Children are no more likely to develop homosexual or bisexual orientations due to their parents being lesbian. Legal barriers can make parenting challenging. A study found that the well-being of children was associated with the social climate of the area in which the family lived. It was supportive of sexual minorities. So this goes back to what we've kept talking about, and that is there are stressors that occur across universally, in this case among parents, but in cases of minorities, and specifically looking at sexual minorities in countries and contexts where they are more disenfranchised at the structural level, and where their neighborhoods are more, they encounter more discrimination based on their sexual orientation, they are going to find that child rearing is a more stressful experience. just because it's kind of that increase factors within their environment that are stressing them out. And they also probably are more likely, in general, minorities, less likely to have financial and personal resources that allow them to buffer the impacts of those additional stressors. Now we're going to look at some models of influence on the family, and then we're going to wrap it up. The parenting effects model family argues that influence is one way from parent, particularly mother, to the child. So this is kind of like a super antiquated way of understanding family dynamics, and that is really just kind of a sexist view that it's just, the mom that's causing all the issues, and the influence is run one way. It's the parent, and typically the mother, historically speaking, that's causing particular family dynamics. The next model argues that child effects model of family influence highlights the influence of children on their parents. Young toddlers elicit sensitive care, whereas older infants who are asserting their wills force parents to set limits. Parents typically become less restrictive as their children mature, and gradually, with parental guidance, become capable of making their own decisions. In response to development, parents shift from parent regulation of the child to co-regulation to self-regulation. So you're probably looking at a lot of these bullet points and saying, oh yeah, this is true. So this is the child effect model, but this is kind of like the opposite of the parent effect model. It's a one-way kind of, it's really the child in the driver's seat is this perspective. And what they're saying is that as the child develops, the parent will react in a particular way. So it's kind of the child dictating the terms. Well, in the parent effect, it's the parent/mother setting the terms, and the parent reacts, and then the child reacts, I should say, in the parent effects model. Next, looking at the interactional model, recognizes that parent and child characteristics may combine in certain ways to influence development, focuses on what characteristics children and parents bring to their interaction. So really looking at the particular characteristics of an individuals, in this case, parent and child, and seeing how they interact. One example is gene-environment interaction. Aggressive behavior is most likely to develop if a child has a variant of the MAO-A gene associated with temper control problems and is raised by an abusive parent. Take the combination of an at-risk child in an abusive environment, so that genetic predisposition for aggression, interacting with the characteristics of the parent, in this case, an abusive parent, interacting together. So you have a predisposition of aggression for the child, an abusive parent, combining together to create kind of an aggressive child. It's that abusive environment activating that genetic predisposition for aggressive behavior within the child. Finally, the transactional model of family influence. Parent and child are seen as influencing one another reciprocally over time. So they're dynamically interacting with each other, forming outcomes. It's not just the parent influencing everything. It's not the child influencing everything. It's not just two sets of characteristics that are set in stone and then they clash. It's that parent and child are shaping each other over time in a reciprocal manner. Child problems may develop when the relationship between parent and child somehow goes bad as they interact. Escalating coercive styles of influence develops. So the characteristics of an individual can change. The characteristics of a parent, of a child, can change through these transactional reciprocal interactions. And that can lead to an escalating coercive cycle. So, something bad can happen, which changes the parent, which can change parenting behavior, which in parent can change the developmental trajectory of a child, and then you're just escalating a cycle of coercion. When a destructive family process evolves, it becomes difficult to say who is most influential, parent or child. Changing a child's problem behavior requires focusing on both parent and child. So the big takeaway here is that dealing with child behavior problems will require focusing on both the parent and the child, because it's a transactional model of family influence. And I should add that other scholars also then add on neighborhoods, the state, the country, etc., who can contribute, who reciprocally interact with individuals, and thus changing them. Again, going back to those Bronfenbrenner systems, interacting with each other, in dynamic ways, changing ourselves as we change the environment around us. So finally, wrapping up with some COVID stuff. COVID long haulers experiencing lingering symptoms even after the acute symptoms of the infection has disappeared. Means if tested, such individuals would now be testing negative for COVID but are still experiencing debilitating effects. According to one study, 72% of COVID long haulers are between 30 and 70 years of age and are more likely to be women. 32% of long haulers were initially asymptomatic and months later started to show symptoms. So the idea here is that even though you're testing negative for COVID, and you could have had it, weeks ago, months ago, you can still have these lingering effects, and it's typically referred to as a COVID long haulers. And there's neurological effects, there's psychological effects, and there are lung and heart problems associated with these COVID long haulers. Now, obviously, this is COVID-19, so we do not know the degree to which and the severity to which that the long hauler symptoms will stay with these individuals, and how these symptoms will change or continue on throughout an individual's lifespan. The virus is simply too new. Interestingly, since the start of vaccinations, 30 to 40% of those individuals with lingering symptoms, aka COVID long haulers, have identified improvements after receiving their shot. So again, kind of a factor that we just don't know about. This is the COVID shot, for whatever reason, the vaccinations decreasing the severity and the amount of symptoms associated with having COVID long haul. And that's all this week. Thanks everyone for watching. Hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Thanks again. Bye.